Number 1. John Norman Collins. During the late 1960s, the quiet college towns of Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor were known for their vibrant student communities and peaceful neighborhoods surrounding the campus of Eastern Michigan University and the nearby University of Michigan. Students walked to classes, attended parties, and moved freely between dormitories, apartments, and downtown cafes. But between 1967 and 1969, that sense of safety began to disappear. Young women started vanishing. At first, each case appeared isolated. Police assumed some victims had simply left town, run away, or become victims of unrelated crimes. But as bodies began to appear in remote areas across southeastern Michigan, investigators slowly realized something horrifying. A serial killer was stalking young women near the campuses. The man eventually identified as responsible was John Norman Collins, a quiet college student whose outwardly normal life hid a deeply violent secret. Collins was born in 1947 in Windsor, before moving with his family to the United States as a child. He grew up primarily in Detroit, where he attended school and later enrolled at Eastern Michigan University. Friends and classmates often described him as polite, intelligent, and somewhat reserved. He studied education and appeared to have ambitions of becoming a teacher. By many accounts, he blended easily into the college environment. Few people around him suspected that he would soon become the focus of one of the most terrifying criminal investigations in Michigan history. The first known victim connected to the case was Mary Flesher, a 21-year-old woman who lived in Ypsilanti. In July 1967, Flesher disappeared after leaving her apartment. Days later, her body was discovered in a wooded area outside the city. The crime scene shocked investigators. The victim had suffered severe violence, and evidence suggested she had been abducted before being killed. At the time, however, police did not immediately recognize the killing as part of a larger pattern. That changed when another young woman vanished the following year. In June 1968, Joan Skelton, an 18-year-old student attending Eastern Michigan University, disappeared while walking near campus. Her body was later discovered in a remote rural area. The similarities between the two murders began to worry investigators. Both victims were young women living near the same university community. Both had been abducted and later found in isolated locations. Still, the connection remained uncertain. But as 1969 began, the violence escalated dramatically. One of the most disturbing cases involved Jane Mixer, a 23-year-old law student at the University of Michigan. Mixer had arranged a ride home through a campus ride board, a common system where students offered or requested transportation. On March 20, 1969, she left her dormitory expecting to meet the person who had agreed to drive her. She never arrived at her destination. Her body was discovered the next day in a cemetery in Denton Township. The brutal nature of the killing intensified public fear. Newspapers across Michigan began reporting on what was now widely believed to be a serial killer targeting college women. As the months passed, more victims were discovered. Alice Callum, a 21-year-old student, disappeared and was later found dead in a rural area. Soon afterward, Marilyn Skelton, a 16-year-old high school student, vanished in Salem. Her body was discovered weeks later in an abandoned farmhouse. By this point, the region was in a state of fear. Students began traveling in groups. Parents warned daughters not to walk alone at night. University administrators issued safety advisories urging caution. Police departments from multiple counties began coordinating their investigations, realizing they were likely dealing with a single killer responsible for multiple murders. The media soon gave the crimes a chilling nickname. They became known as the Michigan Murders. Another victim, Karen Sue Beinman, disappeared in July 1969 after leaving a beauty salon in Ypsilanti. Beinman had been hitchhiking when she vanished. Her body was later discovered in a remote area, confirming investigators' fears that the killer was still active and becoming increasingly bold. But this case would also provide the crucial breakthrough that investigators desperately needed. On the day Beinman disappeared, witnesses reported seeing her get into a car driven by a young man with dark hair. One witness later identified the driver as John Norman Collins. Police began investigating Collins more closely. At the time, Collins was living with his uncle, David Leake, who happened to be a member of the Michigan State Police. When investigators questioned Collins about Beinman's disappearance, his explanations raised suspicions. Eventually, police obtained permission to search the basement of the house where he lived. What they found there shocked even experienced detectives. Evidence connected Collins directly to the murder of Karen Sue Beinman. he was immediately arrested. During the investigation that followed, authorities uncovered disturbing details suggesting Collins was responsible for several of the Michigan murders that had terrified the region. The trial began in 1970 and quickly became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Michigan history. Prosecutors focused primarily on the murder of Karen Sue Beinman, presenting evidence that placed Collins with the victim shortly before her disappearance. Witness testimony, forensic evidence, and investigative findings all pointed to Collins as the killer. The courtroom was often filled with journalists, students, and family members of the victims. For the communities that had lived in fear for years, the trial represented a chance for answers. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. John Norman Collins was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison and sent to Marquette Branch Prison, one of the oldest and most secure correctional facilities in the state. Although Collins was convicted of one murder, investigators and historians widely believe he was responsible for multiple killings connected to the Michigan murders. The true number of victims remains debated. Some investigators believe he may have killed as many as 7 women during the 2-year period when the crimes occurred. Even decades later, the case remains one of the most chilling chapters in the criminal history of Michigan. The murders shattered the sense of safety that once existed in the college towns of Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor. Students who had once walked freely across campus now remembered a time when fear shadowed every quiet street and wooded path. For the families of the victims, the pain never fully faded. Each of the young women who lost their lives had dreams, ambitions, and futures that were abruptly stolen. The investigation that finally exposed John Norman Collins brought justice in the eyes of the law, but it could never undo the tragedy left behind. Today, the story of the Michigan murders continues to be studied by historians and criminal investigators alike. It stands as a grim reminder that even in places known for learning and community, darkness can sometimes hide in the most unexpected places. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 2. Coral Eugene Watts. In the long and troubling history of violent crime in the United States, few cases remain as disturbing and frustrating for investigators as that of Coral Eugene Watts. His story is particularly unsettling, not only because of the number of people believed to have died at his hands, but also because of the strange legal circumstances that eventually allowed him to escape punishment for most of those crimes. Watts was born in 1953 in Kalamazoo, a city located in the southwestern part of Michigan. On the surface, his early life appeared fairly typical. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood and attended local schools, eventually enrolling at Western Michigan University. Those who knew Watts during his youth often described him as quiet, somewhat withdrawn, and socially awkward. He was not known to be particularly aggressive or violent, though some classmates later recalled that he seemed emotionally distant and difficult to read. In high school, Watts played football and participated in sports, appearing outwardly like many other young men in the community. Yet behind that ordinary image, investigators would later discover a deeply troubling personality capable of extreme violence. By the early 1970s, Watts began traveling frequently between Michigan and Texas, where several members of his family lived. It was during this period that police believe his violent behavior began to emerge. One of the earliest known victims linked to Watts was Gloria Steele, a woman attacked in Houston. Steele survived the attack and later described a man who had suddenly entered her home and assaulted her without warning. This type of attack would soon become the disturbing signature of Watts' crimes. Unlike many serial killers who stalk victims for long periods, Watts often struck suddenly and without clear motive. Many attacks occurred during the early hours of the morning, often on weekends when people were relaxing at home. Because of this pattern, investigators and journalists eventually began referring to him as the Sunday morning slasher. Throughout the mid-1970s, a series of mysterious attacks on women occurred in the Houston area. Victims were often strangled, stabbed, or drowned in bathtubs. In many cases, there appeared to be no robbery or personal connection between the attacker and the victim. The crimes seemed random and unpredictable, which made them extremely difficult for police to solve. One particularly shocking case involved Deborah Donnell Johnson, a young woman who was murdered in her own apartment. Neighbors reported hearing noises during the attack, but initially believed it was simply a domestic argument or ordinary disturbance. By the time police arrived, the killer had already disappeared. These attacks continued for years. Investigators struggled to identify a suspect because the crimes occurred across multiple neighborhoods and often left little physical evidence. At the time, forensic technology was far less advanced than it is today, making it difficult to connect separate incidents to a single offender. By the late 1970s, however, detectives began noticing similarities between several unsolved murders. Many of the victims were women living alone, many were attacked inside their homes, and in several cases, the attacks occurred during the early hours of Sunday morning. Despite these similarities, the identity of the killer remained unknown. Meanwhile, Coral Eugene Watts continued living a life that appeared relatively ordinary on the surface. He held various jobs and maintained relationships with friends and family members who had no idea about the violence he was committing. But by 1982, investigators finally caught a break. In May of that year, a woman named Jennifer Joseph survived a brutal attack in Houston. Despite severe injuries, she managed to provide police with a detailed description of her attacker. The description matched Coral Eugene Watts. Police quickly located Watts and brought him in for questioning. During the interrogation, investigators noticed inconsistencies in his story. They also discovered evidence linking him to several of the unsolved attacks. Eventually, Watts confessed to multiple killings. However, the confession came with a major complication. At the time, investigators had limited physical evidence tying him directly to most of the crimes. Many of the murders had occurred years earlier, and forensic methods available in the 1970s had not preserved enough evidence to guarantee convictions. To ensure he would face punishment, prosecutors made a controversial decision. They agreed to charge Watts with only one confirmed murder in exchange for his cooperation in describing other crimes. In 1982, Watts was convicted for the murder of Helen Dutcher in Ferndale. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. For many families of other victims, however, the outcome felt incomplete. Authorities believed Watts had killed far more people than the single case for which he was convicted. Some investigators estimated that the true number of victims could be as high as 80, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The case became even more controversial years later, when a legal technicality threatened to set him free. Due to changes in Texas law, Watts' original sentence was suddenly at risk of being overturned. Prosecutors realized that he might be released much earlier than expected. To prevent this, authorities in Michigan reopened the case involving the murder of Helen Dutcher. In 2004, shortly before Watts was scheduled for release, Michigan prosecutors charged him again and secured a new conviction. This time, he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. For the families of victims, the new sentence brought a measure of relief. Though Watts had escaped prosecution for many suspected murders, at least he would remain behind bars. In 2007, Coral Eugene Watts died in prison at the age of 53 while incarcerated in Ionia Correctional Facility. His death closed one chapter of the case, but it did not answer every question. Even today, investigators continued to debate how many victims Watts may have claimed. Some believe he could have been responsible for dozens of unsolved murders across multiple states. Others suspect that the true number may never be known due to the lack of surviving evidence. What makes the story of Coral Eugene Watts particularly disturbing is the randomness of his crimes. Many serial killers select victims who fit specific patterns or personal motivations. Watts, however, often appeared to attack strangers simply because the opportunity presented itself. Victims were chosen not because of who they were, but because they happened to be alone when he encountered them. This unpredictability made him extremely dangerous. For years, women across multiple cities lived with the fear that a stranger might break into their homes without warning. The case also highlighted serious challenges. In criminal investigations during the 1970s and early 1980s, limited forensic technology and fragmented communication between police departments made it difficult to link crimes across different jurisdictions. If the same series of murders occurred today, modern DNA analysis and national databases might have identified the killer much sooner. Instead, Coral Eugene Watts was able to continue attacking victims for years before authorities finally connected the evidence. Today, his name remains one of the most chilling in the history of American crime. For the people of Michigan, The story of the Sunday morning slasher is remembered as a reminder that even ordinary neighborhoods can sometimes hide unimaginable danger. And for the families of the victims, the memory of those lost lives continues to endure long after the killer himself is gone. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 3. The Bath School Disaster. On the morning of May 18, 1927, the quiet farming community of Bath Township woke up expecting an ordinary school day. Children packed their books, teachers prepared lessons, and parents went about their routines in the small rural town located just outside Lansing. Bath Township was a peaceful agricultural community in Michigan, where most residents knew each other, and life moved at a slow and predictable pace. The town's pride was the Bath Consolidated School, a relatively new building that had been constructed to serve students from the surrounding rural districts. For the children of the township, the school represented opportunity and progress. Instead of traveling long distances to one-room schoolhouses, students now gathered in a modern building where they could learn together. No one in the community could have imagined that the building would soon become the center of the deadliest school attack in American history. The man responsible for the tragedy was Andrew Kehoe, a local farmer who had once served as treasurer of the Bath School Board. Kehoe was known in the community as a skilled electrician and farmer. He had lived in Bath Township for several years with his wife, managing their farm and participating in local affairs. However, those who knew him often described him as quiet, stubborn, and deeply resentful when things did not go his way. In the years leading up to the disaster, Kehoe had become increasingly angry about taxes that had been raised to fund the construction of the consolidated school building. He believed the taxes were unfair and blamed the school board for his growing financial problems. By 1927, Kehoe's resentment had hardened into something far more dangerous. Unknown to the community, he had begun planning a violent act that would devastate the entire town. Using his knowledge of electrical systems and explosives, Kehoe secretly began placing large amounts of dynamite and pyrotolon explosive, surplus material left over from World War I, beneath the floors of the school building. For months, he carefully concealed the explosives in hidden areas of the structure, because he had once worked closely with the school's maintenance and electrical systems. No one questioned his presence around the building. At the same time, Kehoe's personal life was falling apart. His farm was facing foreclosure due to unpaid debts, and his wife, Nellie Kehoe, had been suffering from a prolonged illness. Neighbors later recalled that Kehoe had grown increasingly bitter and withdrawn during this period, but no one suspected that he was preparing an act of mass murder. On the morning of May 18th, Kehoe put the final stage of his plan into motion. Before heading to the school, he murdered his wife at their farmhouse and set the property on fire, destroying much of the building and killing several farm animals. The fire drew the attention of neighbors and local residents, who rushed to help fight the blaze. While many people were distracted by the burning farm, Kehoe made his way toward the school building. At approximately 8:45 a.m., as students sat inside classrooms and teachers began their lessons, a massive explosion tore through the north wing of the Bath Consolidated School. The blast was devastating. Walls collapsed instantly, floors crumbled, and the roof crashed down onto classrooms filled with children. The explosion killed dozens of students and teachers immediately and trapped many others beneath the wreckage. Residents from across Bath Township rushed to the scene, desperate to rescue survivors. Farmers left their fields, parents ran toward the school, and nearby workers joined the chaotic rescue effort. The destruction was overwhelming. Rescuers clawed through rubble with bare hands, searching for trapped children. Some survivors were pulled from the wreckage alive, but many others were found buried beneath heavy beams and collapsed walls. As the rescue effort continued, another horrifying discovery was made. Investigators searching the remaining parts of the building found additional explosives that had not detonated. Nearly 500 pounds of dynamite had been planted in the south wing of the school, but had failed to explode due to a malfunction in the triggering system. Had those explosives detonated as planned, the death toll would have been even greater. While rescuers continued searching the ruins, Andrew Kehoe arrived at the disaster scene in his truck. At first, witnesses assumed he had come to help, but what happened next shocked everyone present. As Kehoe approached the group of rescuers and officials gathered near the wreckage, he detonated another explosive device hidden inside his vehicle. The blast destroyed the truck and killed several additional people, including Kehoe himself. Among those killed in the explosion was Emery Hike, the superintendent of the school district. By the time the chaos ended, the final death toll reached 45 people. 38 of the victims were children, 7 were adults, including teachers, school officials, and local residents. More than 50 others were injured. The tragedy devastated the small community of Bath Township. Nearly every family in the town was affected. Funerals were held for days as grieving parents buried their children. Across Michigan, the disaster shocked the public and drew national attention. Newspapers across the country reported on the horrifying attack. Investigators soon uncovered the full extent of Kehoe's planning. At his farm, authorities discovered additional explosives and a chilling message he had left behind on a sign. The message read, "Criminals are made, not born." The meaning of the statement was never fully understood, but it appeared to reflect Kehoe's belief that society and financial pressures had driven him toward violence. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the destroyed school building was partially demolished and rebuilt. A memorial was later constructed to honor the victims, ensuring that the children and teachers who died would never be forgotten. Even nearly a century later, the Bath school disaster remains the deadliest school attack in American history. The event left a permanent scar on the community of Bath Township and serves as a reminder of how a single act of violence can devastate an entire town. For historians and criminal investigators, the case also stands as one of the earliest examples of large-scale domestic terrorism carried out by a single individual. Though many decades have passed since that tragic morning in 1927, the memory of the children and teachers who lost their lives continues to endure. In the quiet rural landscape of Bath Township, the events of that day are still remembered as one of the darkest moments in the history of Michigan. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 4. Nathaniel Abraham. In the summer of 1997, the city of Pontiac became the center of a criminal case that shocked not only the state of Michigan, but the entire United States. The case involved a suspect so young that many people struggled to comprehend how such a tragedy could occur. The person at the center of the investigation was Nathaniel Abraham, an 11-year-old boy who would soon become one of the youngest individuals ever tried for murder in American history. Pontiac, a city located about 30 miles north of Detroit, had experienced economic struggles for years. Like many industrial cities in the Midwest, it faced unemployment, poverty, and growing concerns about crime in certain neighborhoods. But nothing in the community's recent history prepared residents for what happened on the evening of October 29, 1997. That afternoon, several residents were walking along a quiet street in Pontiac. Among them was Ronald Fournier, a 18-year-old man who had been visiting friends in the area. At the same time, a group of neighborhood children were playing nearby. Among those children was Nathaniel Abraham. Witnesses later told investigators that Abraham had obtained a .22 caliber rifle. According to testimony presented during the trial, the weapon belonged to a relative and had been left unsecured in a nearby home. Holding the rifle, Abraham reportedly began firing several shots from a distance of more than 200 feet. One of those bullets struck Ronald Fournier, fatally wounding him. The sudden shooting stunned the neighborhood. Emergency responders rushed Fournier to the hospital, but he died from his injuries shortly afterward. At first, police believed the shooting might have involved teenagers or adults engaged in criminal activity, but as witnesses described what they had seen, investigators realized something almost unbelievable. The suspected shooter was an 11-year-old child. Police quickly took Nathaniel Abraham into custody. Because of his age, the case immediately raised difficult legal and ethical questions. Under Michigan law, children under a certain age were typically handled within the juvenile justice system. However, the seriousness of the crime forced prosecutors to consider whether Abraham should face charges in adult court. The decision sparked national debate. Some legal experts argued that a child so young could not fully understand the consequences of his actions and should be treated within the juvenile system, which focuses more on rehabilitation than punishment. Others believed that the severity of the crime demanded a stronger legal response. As the investigation continued, prosecutors eventually charged Abraham with first-degree murder, a charge that shocked the public due to the defendant's age. The trial, which began in 1999, drew intense media attention. Journalists from across the country traveled to Pontiac to cover the proceedings. The courtroom often filled with reporters, legal observers, and community members curious about the unprecedented case. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Abraham had intentionally fired the rifle and demonstrated awareness that the weapon could cause serious harm. They presented evidence showing that he had aimed the gun toward the group of people on the street. Defense attorneys, however, argued that Abraham was a child who did not fully understand the consequences of his actions. They emphasized his age, background, and limited maturity. Psychologists testified about child development, explaining how children at that age may struggle to comprehend the permanent impact of violent actions. The defense also argued that the shooting may not have been intended to kill anyone, suggesting it could have been reckless behavior rather than deliberate murder. Throughout the trial, the emotional weight of the case was evident. The family of Ronald Fournier attended the proceedings, grieving the loss of a young man whose life had been cut short. Meanwhile, Abraham himself sat quietly in the courtroom, a small figure whose presence highlighted the unusual and tragic nature of the case. The jury faced a difficult decision. After reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony from both sides, jurors concluded that prosecutors had not proven the charge of first-degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, they found Abraham guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict meant that the court recognized his responsibility for the killing, but also acknowledged the complex circumstances surrounding the case. Following the conviction, the judge sentenced Abraham to detention in a juvenile facility rather than an adult prison. He remained in custody for several years before eventually being released under supervision. The case of Nathaniel Abraham quickly became one of the most widely discussed juvenile justice cases in American history. Legal scholars, psychologists, and policymakers studied the case as an example of the challenges involved in prosecuting very young offenders. Some critics argued that the justice system had been too harsh in charging an 11-year-old with murder. Others believed the case demonstrated the need for stronger gun safety measures to prevent children from accessing firearms. The tragedy also raised broader questions about responsibility, parenting, and community safety. How could a child obtain a firearm so easily? Could the shooting have been prevented? What kind of legal response is appropriate when someone so young commits such a serious crime? For the residents of Pontiac, the incident left a lasting impact. The death of Ronald Fournier and the involvement of a child in the crime created a sense of shock that lingered long after the trial ended. The case remains one of the most unusual and disturbing criminal incidents in the history of Michigan. Unlike many violent crimes involving adults, this tragedy forced society to confront a painful reality. Sometimes the line between childhood and criminal responsibility can become tragically blurred. For the family of Ronald Fournier, the loss was permanent. For Nathaniel Abraham, the case would forever shape the course of his life. And for the broader public, the events of that October evening in 1997 remain a reminder of how complex and heartbreaking the intersection of youth, violence, and justice can be. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 5. Donald Harvey in the history of American crime. Some of the most disturbing cases are those where the person responsible for violence is someone trusted to care for the sick and vulnerable. One of the most chilling examples of this betrayal occurred in hospitals across Michigan and neighboring states during the 1970s and 1980s. At the center of the case was Donald Harvey, a hospital orderly who would later confess to committing dozens of murders while working in healthcare facilities. Harvey was born in 1952 in Hamilton. His childhood was marked by instability and emotional difficulties. Later in life, Harvey claimed that he had experienced abuse and trauma while growing up, though many details of his early life remain disputed. As a teenager, Harvey struggled with feelings of isolation and identity. Friends and acquaintances later described him as quiet and withdrawn, someone who rarely expressed strong emotions. Despite these personal challenges, Harvey managed to find employment in the medical field. In the early 1970s, he began working as a nurse's aide at Marymount Hospital. Later, he moved to Cincinnati, where he worked at Drake Memorial Hospital and other healthcare facilities. Eventually, his work also brought him into hospitals connected to communities across the Midwest, including those serving patients from Michigan. At first, Harvey appeared to be a dedicated and helpful employee. Nurses' aides are responsible for assisting patients with daily tasks, monitoring their condition, and providing comfort to those who are ill or recovering from surgery. Patients and co-workers often trusted Harvey because of his calm demeanor and willingness to help. But behind that calm exterior, something far darker was taking place. Harvey later admitted that he had begun killing patients shortly after starting his job in healthcare. His methods were varied and often difficult to detect. Some victims were poisoned with substances such as arsenic or cyanide. Others were suffocated, injected with lethal chemicals, or deliberately deprived of oxygen. In many cases, Harvey targeted patients who were already seriously ill or elderly. Their deaths were often attributed to natural causes, allowing him to avoid suspicion for years. According to his later confessions, Harvey sometimes claimed that he was motivated by what he called mercy killings, believing that he was ending the suffering of patients who were already close to death. But investigators eventually concluded that this explanation did not account for many of the murders. Some victims were not terminally ill, and others were killed in ways that suggested cruelty rather than compassion. In reality, Harvey's motivations appeared to be complex and deeply disturbing. During interviews with police and psychologists, he sometimes described feelings of anger or resentment toward certain patients or co-workers. Other times, he admitted that the killings gave him a sense of power and control. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Harvey continued working in hospitals while secretly committing murders. Because many of his victims were already sick, their deaths rarely attracted serious investigation. Hospital staff members often assumed that complications from illness or age were responsible, but eventually, patterns began to emerge. In the mid-1980s, suspicious incidents at Drake Memorial Hospital drew the attention of administrators. Several patients had died under unusual circumstances while Harvey was on duty. One incident involved a patient whose oxygen supply had been tampered with. Another involved unexplained poisoning. Hospital officials reported their concerns to police, and investigators began looking more closely at Harvey's activities. In 1987, authorities finally confronted him. When questioned by detectives, Donald Harvey made a shocking confession. He admitted to killing numerous patients over a period of more than a decade. At first, he claimed responsibility for around 37 murders. Later, he suggested that the true number might be even higher. The investigation that followed revealed one of the most extensive cases of medical serial killing in American history. Prosecutors ultimately linked Harvey to dozens of deaths across multiple hospitals. Some investigators believed the true number of victims could be more than 80. In 1987, Harvey pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder in order to avoid the death penalty. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. For the families of the victims, the revelations were devastating. Many had believed their loved ones had died from natural causes. Learning that those deaths were actually murders committed by a trusted hospital worker was almost impossible to comprehend. The case also triggered major reforms in hospital oversight and patient safety procedures. Healthcare institutions across the country began reviewing their policies to ensure that suspicious deaths would be investigated more thoroughly. Background checks, supervision, and incident reporting systems were strengthened in an effort to prevent similar tragedies. Despite his imprisonment, Harvey continued to attract public attention. Criminologists studied his case to better understand the psychology of medical serial killers. Some experts classified him as an angel of death killer, a term used to describe healthcare workers who murder patients under the guise of providing care. But Harvey's own statements often contradicted the idea that his crimes were motivated purely by mercy. In interviews conducted during his time in prison, he sometimes described the killings with disturbing detachment. In 2017, after spending nearly 3 decades behind bars, Donald Harvey died in prison at the age of 64. He was killed by another inmate at Toledo Correctional Institution. With his death, the possibility of learning the full truth about his crimes largely disappeared. Many investigators believe that not all of Harvey's victims were ever identified. Because he worked in multiple hospitals and states including facilities connected to communities in Michigan, it may never be possible to determine the exact number of lives he took. Today, the story of Donald Harvey remains one of the most disturbing examples of betrayal in the history of healthcare. Hospitals are meant to be places of healing and safety, where patients trust doctors and caregivers with their lives. Harvey exploited that trust in the most horrifying way imaginable. For the families who lost loved ones, the pain of those losses remains, and for the medical community, the case serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of vigilance, accountability, and protecting the vulnerable from those who might abuse positions of trust. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 6. John Norman Collins. During the late 1960s, the state of Michigan experienced one of the most terrifying crime waves in its history. Over a period of 2 years, a series of brutal murders targeting young college women shocked communities across the region and created widespread fear among students. The person responsible for these crimes would eventually become known as the Michigan Co-ed Killer, a name that reflected the horrifying pattern investigators began to uncover. At the center of the case was John Norman Collins, a college student who managed to hide a violent secret while living among the very people he would later target. In the late 1960s, college campuses across the United States were experiencing a period of cultural change. Students gathered in large numbers, dormitories were busy with activity, and universities represented freedom and opportunity for thousands of young people. In Ypsilanti, home to Eastern Michigan University, the atmosphere was no different. Students attended classes, socialized, and enjoyed the independence that college life offered. But in 1967, that sense of safety began to disappear. The first known victim connected to the case was Mary Flesher, a 19-year-old student who disappeared in July of that year. Her body was discovered days later in a rural area near Ann Arbor. The discovery shocked the community, but at first investigators believed it might be an isolated crime. Unfortunately, it was only the beginning. Over the next 2 years, several more young women disappeared under mysterious circumstances. In 1968, another victim, Joan Skell, vanished after leaving a party in Ann Arbor. Her body was later found in a wooded area. As the number of victims increased, investigators began noticing similarities between the cases. Many of the victims were college students. Several had last been seen near university campuses, and in multiple cases, the victims had been strangled or violently assaulted before their bodies were abandoned in remote locations. Despite these similarities, police struggled to identify a suspect. At the time, forensic science was still developing, and investigators lacked many of the tools that modern detectives rely on today. As a result, the killer continued operating for months without being caught. More victims followed. One of the most disturbing cases involved Jane Mixer, a law student whose body was discovered in 1969 near Ypsilanti. Her murder intensified public fear and placed enormous pressure on police departments across Michigan. By this point, newspapers had begun referring to the unknown attacker as the Michigan Co-ed Killer. Students across multiple universities became increasingly fearful. Parents worried about their daughters attending school far from home. Campus officials urged students to travel in groups and avoid walking alone at night. Despite the growing concern, the killer remained unidentified. But behind the scenes, investigators were slowly closing in on the truth. One of the victims, Karen Sue Beinman, disappeared in July 1969. Witnesses reported seeing her talking to a man shortly before she vanished. The description of the man eventually led investigators to John Norman Collins. At the time, Collins was a student at Eastern Michigan University and lived in an apartment near the campus. Two friends and classmates, he appeared to be an ordinary college student. He studied education and hoped to become a teacher. But investigators soon discovered disturbing evidence linking him to the murders. One key witness reported seeing Beinman entering Collins' car shortly before she disappeared. Police began monitoring Collins and eventually searched the home of his uncle, where Collins had been staying. Inside the house, investigators discovered evidence suggesting that a violent struggle had taken place. When confronted by police, Collins attempted to escape. He fled the house and ran through the neighborhood before being captured by officers. His arrest marked the end of one of the most terrifying crime sprees in Michigan history. During the trial that followed, prosecutors presented evidence connecting Collins to the murder of Karen Sue Beinman. Although investigators suspected he was responsible for several other murders, the evidence available at the time was strongest in this particular case. In 1970, John Norman Collins was convicted of Bindman's murder and sentenced to life in prison. Authorities believe he may have been responsible for at least 7 murders, though some investigators suspect the true number could be higher, because forensic technology in the late 1960s was limited. Many of the other cases could never be definitively linked to him in court. Nevertheless, the pattern of the crimes strongly suggested that a single individual had committed them. The terror caused by the Michigan co-ed murders left a lasting impact on the region. Universities across Michigan implemented stronger safety measures for students. Campus security programs expanded, and awareness about personal safety increased dramatically. Even decades later, the case remains one of the most disturbing chapters in Michigan's criminal history. The idea that a college student living among his peers could secretly commit such violent acts shocked the public and challenged assumptions about what a serial killer might look like. Today, John Norman Collins remains in prison, serving a life sentence. For the families of the victims, the pain of those losses has never fully faded, and for the communities affected by the crimes, the memory of those dark years continues to serve as a reminder that even places meant for learning and opportunity can sometimes become the setting for unimaginable tragedy. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.